Good evening, YouTube. You guys are now watching another segment of TheCaliEffect. Today, for Technique Tuesday, we're going to be discussing how to use your staples properly. Now, I know I had a video about Mystical Space Typhoon in a previous Technique Tuesday, but we're going to go over it a little bit more, mainly because I think I didn't go over it perfectly. Now, in this current format, our premier staples are Book of Moon, Mystical Space Typhoon, and Dark Hole. Pot of Duality and cards like that, you know, those one-ofs that are just really good, weren't included because most decks really include the Mystical Space Typhoon, the Dark Hole, and the Book of Moon. Well, let's start off with Book of Moon. Book of Moon is an extremely versatile card. It is amazing. It stops synchro plays. It stops XC plays. It stops your opponents from attacking. It is probably the best neg 1 in this game, and it's a reason why it's limited. Book of Moon should be used in most decks. Any deck that requires some type of control, any deck that wants to render your opponent from stopping from Exceed or Synchro plays, or if you're a battle reliant deck that just needs to flip face down your opponent's monsters, it's just an extremely versatile card. The perfect time to use it is when your opponent needs to get their play the most. You don't want to just blind go ahead and Book of Moon your opponent. You want to wait until they're attacking you. You want to wait until they're trying to go for a critical Exceed play or Synchro play. But it's just so many uses for Book of Moon. You can't really gauge the perfect time to use it. It's almost excusable to misplay with Book of Moon because there's so many times where Book of Moon should be saved or should have been used where it isn't critical. Obviously, knowledge is power, so if you know your opponent's hand, Book of Moon becomes a lot more deadlier. Or even if you just know how your opponent deck plays, your Book of Moon becomes very deadly. An extremely amazing card. Next, we're going to be talking about Dark Hole. Now, I've seen a lot of players activate Dark Hole when they don't need it. They'll activate it on monsters that they can get rid of with their own monster effects, monsters that they can take control of. You want to save your Dark Hole until there's a point in time where you have to hit the panic button. During any game when I'm playing Yu-Gi-Oh, you always want to set a panic button. When you know your opponent has clear advantage, or you know there is a point in time where you're going to lose, you hit that panic button, and that's when you activate Dark Hole. Do not, and I repeat, do not activate Dark Hole just because you want to get rid of your opponent's monsters, just because they have so many monsters and you think it's quote-unquote advantage. You want to get rid of your opponent's monsters when they need it the most, when you need it the most, and you want to maximize on those plays. A prime example would be if your opponent had just 4 useless monsters on the board. Now, Dark Hole would get rid of those 4 useless monsters, you're correct. But what does the opponent have in hand? What does the opponent have in graveyard? Did your opponent plus off of these summons? Does your opponent really need it? Obviously, if there are 3 Lilas in defense and a face-up Raikou, it's not going to be good against your opponent. But if it just so happened to be 3 Judgment Dragons in a BLS, that is a pivotal time to use Dark Hole. Stop misusing Dark Hole, people. Another good thing about Dark Hole is that it destroys some of your monsters. Now, I know that might not sound great, but there are some times when you need to put your monsters in the graveyard, maybe for a Blackluster Soldier play, a Chaos Sorcerer play, putting Light Swarms in the graveyard. It's just so many reasons why you should be using Dark Hole in almost any given deck. Like I said, with Book of Moon and like I should be saying, with Book of Moon and Dark Hole, these are the more aggressive spell cards that should be ran in aggressor type decks. Dark Hole should be ran, like I said, in almost any deck, and I guess unless you're playing Burn or Exodia or something like that, you just typically don't need these cards. You need to be drawing or doing something else. But just about any other deck should be running at least Dark Hole or Book of Moon. If you can't run Dark Hole for some strange reasons, there are some decks that just can't run Dark Hole. Book of Moon normally suffices for flipping your opponent's monsters face down, gives you some type of monster board or some type of resource, and then Dark Hole typically wipes them out. I've seen a lot of people just ignore Book of Moon, which is just a really good card and shouldn't be overlooked. Now, the biggest part of the discussion is Mystical Space Typhoon. Now, over the course of my videos, you guys have been hearing me about blind Mystical Space Typhoons and how I hate when people blind Space Typhoon. I even go as far to saying when somebody blind Space Typhoons me, I get all hope for them of being a good player just went out the window. I feel extremely confident, and people who blind Space Typhoon tend to not win a lot of games against really good players, because the logic behind it is if your opponent has 4 Vaporeon face down, We flip them face down. And one of them is obviously the money card, is the pivotal play card. And then the other two, don't get me wrong, they're not bad cards. They could be bluffs. And your opponent just goes, duh, blind space typhoon. Let's say they do hit the pivotal card. If they still have to deal with these two face downs, they're still probably going to lose. The blind space typhoon didn't hit. Especially when people go, duh, blind space typhoon, set a monster in turn. Like, that did not help you whatsoever. Why would you use space typhoon if you're not going to try to take advantage of your opponent having less back row? It makes no sense. If you do hit that pivotal card, whoop-de-damn-do, good for you. The odds of you hitting that pivotal card and 3 back row is 33%. If your opponent's a smart player, the chances become less because your opponent will play pretty big mind games with you. They'll set the mystical space typhoon in the middle or something like that, and then people just tend to always typhoon the middle. That's what's so crazy. They typhoon that middle card, and you're like, okay, typhoon your other back row. It's okay to blind space typhoon if somebody is typhooning your face down typhoon. It's perfectly fine because then they lost a card from their hand. And then they lost a card on the field from blind space typhoon. But it's not okay to openly hit major back row that you have no idea of. If you don't know what your opponent has face down, then you're definitely asking for trouble. But let's give you another situation where typhoon or blind typhooning would be quote-unquote acceptable. Let's say I'm playing Fire Fist, and these two Vaporeons you already know are Tinky and YuGiOh. You know that this is the live back row, and you need to go for a huge push. Then that blind space typhoon isn't so blind because you know these two targets. That's one of the acceptable things. Another thing I want to talk about is the difference between Mystical Space Typhoon and almost any other destruction card, back row destruction card. Mystical Space Typhoon is a quick play spell card. Now, a lot of people, I don't know what's wrong with them, but I stress that Mystical Space Typhoon is a quick play spell card, meaning that you can activate it during your draw phase, during your standby phase, during your battle phase as long as it isn't damage step, during your end phase, during main phase 2 and main phase 1, and on your opponent's turn. That's what gives this card so much power. That's what makes this card so much powerful, is because you can activate it anytime. Send your monsters out there to bait those two back row or whatever that back row is. Send them out there to force your opponent to use it. And when they need that last back row the most, you follow up with that face down Mystical Space Typhoon or your Typhoon in hand to get rid of that back row and finish for game. Your monsters are extremely replenishable in this card game now. It isn't back then back in the days when your one normal summon was everything that you know. You either have a lot of protection in your deck if you're doing that, or you can drop a load of monsters. Take advantage of that, people. Take advantage of the fact that you can summon a massive amount of monsters and ruin your opponent's back row. Make them waste their resources on your monsters, on your +1 monsters, and everything else in between. Mystical Space Typhoon is an amazing card, but it's not always, it shouldn't always be ran at 3. Some decks don't run any, which is perfectly fine. It's a very versatile card, but it's not meant for every deck. Don't try to cram 3 Mystical Space Typhoons in every single deck that doesn't need it against a format that doesn't have back row. Mystical Space Typhoon is prime, in my opinion, at 2. I believe that if you are running Mystical Space Typhoon, you main the 2 of them, you side the 3rd. The logic behind this is, yes, it's a quick play spell card. At the very least, if you're going against a deck with no back row, you can bluff that Typhoon. You can set those Typhoons face down and have your opponent have that same effect. Have them think that this is back row. Okay, I need to get rid of this back row. I need to waste this back row. And if they're a bad player, they're just going to go ahead and blind space Typhoon your Typhooning. You don't lose anything. You get to keep your genuine back row. Also, against the back row decks that don't, or against back row decks, you still have Typhoons. And if you use them correctly, you'll be able to capitalize on all of your opponent's plays. Those Fiendish Chains, Call It a Hunted, those continuous cards, the field spell cards, you'll be able to capitalize with them. Just overall, a really, really good card. A lot of people don't know how to use them correctly, so you should take advantage if you know how to use them correctly. You don't want to use them blindly. You want to conserve them, and you want to use them at the right time. Obviously, I can't tell you what every situation is at the right time in this video, so you have to decide from yourself, probably with a lot of play and experience. Play test with your friends, definitely find out. Now, the logic behind 3 Mystical Space Typhoons in main board is if your format or your locals consist of 5 back row every single time. And I'm talking about if you play 5 matches at your locals and 4 of them are set 5 back row, then the 3 Mystical Space Typhoon in your main board becomes very acceptable, and I don't even knock it. Another big thing is just don't misuse your Mystical Space Typhoons. That's all I can really say. Just a really versatile card, extremely good. But thank you guys for watching another segment of the Cali Effect. Please like, comment, subscribe, but most of all, enjoy.